Okay, now we're going to move on to a discussion of the Great Depression, and this is and basically to continue. We're pointing towards the great development of electricity. We talked about in the last lecture how the development of electricity, or the harnessing of electricity beginning in the mid-19th century, right? The mid-19th century, and the gradual, the introduction of electricity into electric motors, electricity into households in the early 20th century, the increase in use of electricity in manufacturing that really took off in the 1920s. One of the things that we think about is, as we talked about the last time, that this may have played an important role in the rise of stock prices in the 1920s in the United States. The Dow Jones Industrial Index, the Dow Industrials Index in the 1920s, that is an index of 30 major companies, and of course that changes over time. But in the 1920s, many of the companies that were in that index were considered to be companies that were cutting edge, using cutting edge technology in that era. In manufacturing, there were manufacturers that were involved with developing new techniques for production that were really taking off in the 1920s. And as we noted, and in a paper that I assigned to you for reading, that there's a clear connection between the increases in stock prices in the 1920s and announcements of new patents that companies and investors were seeing, that companies were making investments and coming up with new inventions and new patents that were that they expected to have an effect on productivity and on production, and that effect would then translate into enhanced profits, and which in turn would increase the value of the companies. So as a result, there was a steady increase in stock prices from during the 1920s. So here from 1921, we have an index set for 100. It's adjusted for inflation. We see a steady rise to about 160 by 1927, so a 60% increase. Solid, but not overly dramatic, and that's adjusted for inflation. So a solid, but not out of control increase. And then in 1927, stock prices started increasing dramatically, so that by the fall of 1929, stock prices were 250% higher. That 350 relative to so 3.5 times higher relative to their prices in 1920, and that is adjusted for inflation. So we've taken out the inflation that took place during that. This is real. This is a real increase in stock prices during this time. This is quite a dramatic increase, and as we'll see later, something very similar happened in the 1990s with tech stocks, and we'll go over that later when we talk about the Great Recession. So this was a major increase in stock prices, and one of the things that the points that I want to make here is that the increase in stock prices was excessive. That in fact what would turn out was that this increase in stock prices would have required companies to realize profit increases productivity and gains that would have resulted in profit increases much sooner than in fact where it was to take place. And so because of that, because the value of a company is the expected future, the value of the expected future profits over time, discounted to the present at some discount rate, so that if those profits go out further in the future, then that discounting to the present means that it has a lower value than if you think that those increased profits are going to come in the short run. So by 1929, by late 1929, investors began to realize that they had overshot, and so there was a dramatic decline. There was a bursting of what was a bubble, a stock market bubble, and so this bursting played an important role in leading to the Great Depression. But before I do that, I want to talk briefly about some of the 1920s. Was a boom in office construction, and these were skyscrapers, the skyscrapers that had never been seen before. There was a new ability to construct tall buildings out of steel, so improvements in steel and understanding in engineering led to the ability to construct taller buildings than had ever been seen before. And you'll note that many of these buildings that came out in the mid to late 1920s came out at a time when the stock market itself was going up. So there was this excitement, this exuberance about the future of the economy. It's also important to remember that this was embodied in the architectural style of that era. These were building styles that celebrated machinery, that celebrated the in production advancements in technology, and so that was expressed in these buildings. So these advancements in technology was heralding what was seen as a new age in manufacturing. It was going to be a new age that was going to have dramatic benefits, immediate benefits, and it was reflected in the architectural styles of that era. This is a very famous. Here's the Chrysler Building, the first one on the left, a very famous building in New York. If you've been to New York, you've seen it. It's a very iconic building in the New York City skyline in Midtown Manhattan. It's a lovely building that was started in 1928 and completed in 1929, right around the time of the Great Depression. The New York Empire State Building, another famous building, was started in 1929, and again right around the time of the stock market crash. So these are buildings that went up and that were completed right around the time of the stock market crash. Here's some other examples. This was in Detroit, the Fisher Building in 1928. A building in Detroit. Here's an interior of a building in Detroit, the Guardian Building. And if you ever go to Detroit, this is one of the interior. And you're interested in architecture, you'll want to go and see this building. It's one of the loveliest examples of what's called Art Deco. And in fact, these buildings were all, in one way or another, were in what was called an architectural style called Art Deco. And Art Deco essentially celebrated the machine and the advancement of the machine and improvements in production technology, electricity, and the ability to produce goods. The Chrysler Building was the headquarters of the Chrysler Corporation, the Automobile Corporation, and in fact used automobile motifs on the building. And that was, of course, the development of the automobile was an important part of the expansion of the economy. Detroit was where that expansion in automobile production was centered. The center of the manufacturing economy in the United States in the 1920s was Detroit, and so you can see that was embodied in that kind of very beautiful. It's a very beautiful architectural style. Here's a building from Chicago. That's the Chicago Board of Trade. That was where trade, an important stock exchange in the United States, and that was in the mid-20s. And here's an example in government. This is the City Hall of Los Angeles that was completed in 1928. So all of these very, very much the kinds of architectural styles that were seen in the 1920s. It's also very important to note that these buildings went up, and when they were completed, and there was some building in the early 1930s that was a carryover from that construction boom, but that in many of these cities, there was, in many of these major cities in the United States, there was very little office construction that went on afterwards, after this boom took place, until about the 1950s. So this was a period more than 20 years in many of these places where there was before there was any further construction, a significant office construction that took place. So this was when this boom ended. There was a long period of very little construction, and so when you go to these cities, you can see that in the architecture. That buildings from the 1920s are there, but very little building from the 1930s and 1940s. And a very good example, Detroit, in fact, is a city where there was very little construction at all that went on after the collapse of the stock market in the late 1920s. So we had a construction boom that took place during the 1920s. Here is the real GDP, and what I've done is an index, and this is 1920. I use 1929 as set that equal to 100. Now this is data I've gotten from the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank, U.S. Federal Reserve Bank, the St. Louis branch. It's a great site there for economic data, and focus on the United States, but in many other countries as well. So it's a great site. If you're interested in economic research, it's one of those sites that you'll want to go to get data. Is the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank site, and I use that for. I've gotten a lot of data off of that. You'll note that the U.S. It's here in 1929 because that's when the data this database doesn't start until 1929 in the United States. The figures before that are based on production figures, but the U.S. doesn't have good data on GDP before 1929. What's interesting, the UK does, and in fact, the UK has a GDP has estimates of GDP that go all the way back to 1700. So that's very interesting. So I've used that in order to make the comparison. This shows the increase in GDP in the United Kingdom during the 1920s, and undoubtedly this would have been the same as in the U.S. would have had a similar increase. And we know, you can see there were downturns in the UK during that period. And if you look, the UK increase from the mid-80s to 100, a 15% increase. It's not a great increase. The U.S. probably increased a bit more during that period, but But what's interesting to note is that we see very dramatic increases in stock prices here, and in fact, it's even to 1927. That's more than 50% increase in real terms in stock prices. That's real increase in GDP, which is much more modest increase in GDP during that period than was the increase in stock prices. And in fact, when you compare the dramatic increase by 1929 here, and you compare that with the quite modest increase in GDP in the UK, again, there was probably a slightly greater economic expansion in the United States during the 1920s, but we just don't have good data on that. And we can also see the severity of the downturn in the United States. This represents from 100 in 1929. By 1933, that index was down to about 73. That's a 27% decline in real terms. So real decline of 27%. Now, what's important to note there is because, in fact, there was deflation in the United States during that period, the nominal GDP actually declined by greater than that. It declined by more than 30% during that period. But the real GDP was not as much of a decline. But still, this is a nearly 30% decline in GDP in the United States, in real GDP in the United States, from the peak in 1929 to the trough in 1933. And so we can see that there was much less decline in the United Kingdom, in Great Britain, during that period. And in fact, what we'll want to also make a comparison is with other countries to see what took place. But before we do that, let's talk about the causes of the Great Depression. And I've taken this from an article that the economist Christina Romer, who teaches at UC Berkeley in the United States, very well-known university there, and it was from an article that she wrote titled "The Great Depression," and I'm going to send that. If I haven't already sent that to you, I may not have. I'll check that. If I haven't, I'll send that to you. I'll want you to read this. It's a very good short discussion on the Great Depression and the causes of the Great Depression. The Great Depression was perhaps the worst economic downturn experienced by the world since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. There had been a number of downturns, panics in the 19th century, but so there were periods of economic contraction, and some of those were significant, but nothing was quite like the Great Depression probably since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution that was experienced. And this Great Depression, it originated in the United States, and this is an important thing to remember because we're going to compare that in a lot of ways the Great Recession was also something that originated, an economic event that originated in the United States. So Christine Romer notes the following points concerning the period prior to the onset of the Depression during the 1920s. That the 1920s saw reasonable but not dramatically rapid economic expansion in the United States. I noted that earlier. Here, you can see that, at least in the UK, and that probably was the case in the United States. The 1920s experienced a construction boom, particularly in residential housing. Now, we've noted this construction boom of office building, but there was an even greater, in terms of an expansion of residential housing, a big boom in residential housing construction in the United States in the 1920s. And we'll see that there's some similarities with what took place in the United States a little in the 1990s and 2000s. A little bit different, but there are some similarities. And she noted also what we've previously noted, the dramatic increase in stock prices in the United States during that period. So she then discusses in her article the Great Depression's timeline, and that began, it's thought to have begun with the bursting of the stock market bubble in October of 1929. So this stock market bubble right there, the peak of the market that's achieved in 1929 what was called the Great Crash, Black Monday, in the United States. Is it Monday or Friday? I'm going to check. Maybe it was Black Friday, but maybe it is called Black Friday. But it's known as that because that was the dark day when the stock market collapsed, and as a result of that collapse, the United States would go into a major depression after that. So what Romer talks about is that this stock market bubble, a lot of people were wiped out as a result of the stock market crash. Many people in finance were wiped out. People had borrowed money to buy stocks. Interestingly, this took place in the 1990s as well, as we'll see later. People borrowed money, and it's called purchasing stock on margin, with an expectation that stock prices would rise. And so when stock prices collapsed, people could not repay the loans because the stock was worth much less than the value of the loan. So when that took place, there were many people were financially ruined as a result. The stock market, the collapse of the bubble, and it was a dramatic collapse that by in October, in only about 2 months before the end of 1929, the stock market had lost a third of its value. And we'll see a little bit later exactly the real terms that took place. It was a major reduction in stock prices that would be that by 1931 would be nearly 80% in nominal terms. Massive decline in stock prices. The stock market crash reduced aggregate demand in the United States. Business investment and consumer spending fell sharply as a result of the stock market crash. Business investment, businesses began thinking that the economic expansion was not going to continue. They pulled back. Consumers saw that, began worried about the effect of the collapse in the stock market bubble on their ability to spend, and so consumer spending fell sharply. So as a result, there was a reduction in aggregate demand in the United States. There were also the financial system experienced a major panic. There was a banking panic, and a series of banking panics between the fall of 1930 and early 1933. So 4 waves of banking panics in just a little bit over 3 years. So basically every 9 to 10 months, there was during this period, there was another wave, a significant wave of failures of banks. Now it's important to remember that at this time, that bank deposits were not guaranteed. There was no the government did not provide guarantees on. There was not insurance that banks had that was and that are now in many cases, including both in Japan and in the United States, that the government backs the finance for the deposits. Banks, protects deposits by savers. Because there was no protection, what would happen when a bank failed? Because what a bank does is a bank lends out more money than it has on deposits. And so that it's built on a pyramid of more lending than there are deposits, because at any one time when you're lending money, only a certain fraction of that is used by the people that are borrowing the money. And so as a result, banks tend to lend out a lot more, have a lot more value of loans on their books than they have in deposits. So that if for some reason, as what happened in the early 1930s, there was a contraction in business investment and consumer spending, and that if businesses and consumers get scared, as they clearly did in the early 1930s in the United States and in the industrial world, then people are worried about their savings, because if banks fail, since there's no deposit insurance, then if the banks fail, then that means they're insolvent, and if they're insolvent, they have no money. So that even if you have a deposit in the bank, there's no money. So people you'd lose all of your money. So because of that, as soon as people became worried that a bank was in trouble, then you had what was called a run on the bank, that people rushed to the bank in order to get their money out, because they were worried. They knew that if the bank closed, that they would lose all of their money. This was reflected in the currency to bank deposit ratio. The currency to bank deposit ratio shows the amount of currency that households hold relative to the amount of money that they have deposited in banks. So as consumers pull their money out of banks by deposit withdrawals, then the currency to bank ratio rises. Then banks started closing, and it was a spiral effect. Once the banking system begins to contract, then there's potentially no end to it. You might not get an end for a very long time, and when that takes place, then there's a dramatic loss of savings, because the bank capital gets wiped out. So this is a very important development, a dramatic increase in the currency to bank ratio in the United States. So as a result, there was a great crash. Here's the crash in stock market prices. Now this is the 350. This was the same point. Right there, that point in 350 in 1929, that is the same point, that's the same point here, and you can see by 1933, it's less than 100, so in real terms, 100, it's a more than, it's a more than 60% decline, 70% decline in GDP during this period from 1929 to 1933. Major decline in stock prices, a little bit of an increase during 1933, but then another leveling off in 1935. So we can see, and let's go back again to here, we can see that by 1930, it's not until 36 that 1936 that GDP actually reached the stage where it was considered the same level as in as in the year 1929. So in terms of adjusted for inflation, that in fact that it took until 1936, 1937 before the amount of GDP increased over that of 1929.